I get to the extreme pleasure of being able to introduce Susan Rashane. Susan will tell you how many years I've been after her to share her spiritual journey. She's been asked and asked and asked, and she said yes this year. So I was trying to think of how to introduce her, and I went and did internet research and then went to her book and decided the best way is to read about the author from the book In the Loop of Earth and Sky, which Susan wrote in, was it 2015?
2013.
2013. So Susan Rashane brings rich, creative experience and deep passion for human rights and peacemaking to her writing and to her living. She views the interconnectedness of all beings with the earth as central to what it means to be here and to our responsibility for our planet and its inhabitants. Susan's paths in education, child advocacy, family support services, church ministries, hospice care, environmental preservation, and parenting are integrated in her reflections in this volume. She resides with her husband in upstate New York, and we know Fairport, New York, spending time in the Finger Lakes region, New England, and we know that to be Massachusetts, and Southern California. And I think of Susan and several of the rest of you as my role models for how to be a long-distance grandparent and parent. So Susan, we are so glad you're here today. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you, Carolyn. Is this at the right angle here? To be honest with you, as I thought about doing this month, the month progressed, and I kept thinking how untimely to be talking about my life in the midst of all that is going on in our country and in the world. And I thought, the timing of this is really not what I would hope. But maybe it's not the timing, maybe it's the circumstances. And the more I thought about it, I thought, what now, God? Why have I been asked to do this at this time? And she's right, I have been asked year after year. And I came close last year, and then it was Bob who took the mantle. So as Joan and Bill said one time a couple of years ago when they shared their journey, maybe it's time now, we ought to do it pretty soon. So I thought maybe I ought to do it pretty soon. But I came to a place where I accepted that we still need to honor and recognize and be grateful for the preciousness of life and for each life, and I for my life. And that we need to affirm what a miracle it is that we're here at all. And also to recognize that we are not alone in all of this, that there is a great spirit, a holy one, a beloved one with us, in us, working through us. And it's so easy right now to forget that. So I made my peace with that this was the time, February 1st, 2026, and went ahead with what I had said I would do. Now, while Julie Andrews always, well, most of us here are old enough to remember her, let's start at the very beginning, a very good place to start. And I always thought that was a delightful, well, I loved the sound of music for years, but also that, of course, start at the beginning. But I, being my independent, wild and willful self, decided not to start at the very beginning. So I'm starting with three pieces of writing, very short pieces of writing, that I think are let's think of them as a trailer. If this was a documentary, and in a way it is a documentary of my life, although I don't have them up on the screen, all the pictures up on the screen. But that this is kind of a look into my life, or kind of a hint at what I will be sharing. And then one of them I changed. And so if you'll give me just a moment, I need to find something online. I watch Lee's first inversion singers, many of them reading the music off of their iPads. Some still have their music in their black folders, and some of them hold their iPads. It's probably true on Sunday mornings also. So this is my first step into using technology and sharing something. I don't think I'll ever get to the place of doing it in a sermon. But anyway, the first piece of writing that I want to share is from Nan Merrill's book, Psalms for Praying. And it's her translation of Psalm 121. I'm not going to read the whole psalm in the interest of time, but I'm going to read the second part of Psalm 121. For you are the great counselor. You dwell within all hearts, that we might respond to the universal heart. Like the sun that nourishes us by day, like the stars that guide the wayfarer at night, in you we shall not be afraid of the darkness, for you are the light of our life. May you keep us in our going out and our coming in from this day forth and forevermore. Psalm 121. The second part I was going to read, as I say, is part of a trailer for what I'm going to be sharing. 3 weeks ago was part of The Summer Day by Mary Oliver. I can't go there right now. The day will come when I can read that poem and feel like it's timely. The last line, as many of us remember, is what will you do with your wild and precious life? And that question remains for all of us. But instead, I want to read just a little bit from Amanda Gorman's poem in memory of Alex Preddy. I'm not going to read the whole poem, just the second half of it. Know that to care intensively, united, is to carry both pain, dark horror for today, and a profound, daring hope for tomorrow. We can feel we have nothing to give and still beloved this world waiting, trembling to change. If we cannot find words, may we find the will. If we ever lose hope, may we never lose our humanity. The only undying thing is mercy. The courage to open ourselves like doors, hug our neighbor, and save one more bright, impossible life. This, to me, is scripture, sacred scripture. And I wanted to preface my comments and my stories with this. So I think the third is a quote by the late President Jimmy Carter, who many of you know I have been very fond of and continue to admire his work. And this quote is this: what are the things that you can't see that are important? I would say justice, truth, humility, service, compassion, love. You can't see any of these, but they're the guiding lights of a life. So with these kind of teasers, making you wonder if I'm going too far astray, I will share a bit of background history. I was born in Bronxville, New York. as part of a baby boomer generation. And here many of us are. An older brother was stillborn, so I was much anticipated and very much desired baby born to what at the time were considered older parents. I think that has come back into whatever now. We have a number of older parents, as Sam and I were talking about. My younger brother came along 3 years later, and with this, our parents decided a third-story apartment on Midland Avenue near the Crosstown Expressway was an unsatisfactory place to raise a family. So they moved close to their roots in upstate New York. Their roots were in Fredonia. We lived in Hamburg, about 45 minutes away. Without going into a lot of detail, I'll set the scene I grew up in. The scene is or was held or shown through order, punctuality, repression of feelings, tradition, frugality, productivity, and accountability. Those were part of the mores of the childhood home that I grew up in the 50s and the 60s. Values grew out of a Victorian age in which life was serious. Behavior was of utmost concern. There was a quote I heard more than once, that if your behavior is as good as you look, you'll do just fine. I never thought I looked that good, so I didn't have a lot to hope for. But anyway, that was an oft-repeated phrase. And privacy was next to godliness. You didn't hang out anything that people might not want to know. This being said, I did have many happy times, though I did push the boundaries of propriety. Years later, actually after my parents passed, or when we were closing up the house in Hamburg, I came across my baby book, and because I was the first child, it was kept assiduously. And there was a developmental page for personality or something like traits, but it was a small box, couldn't describe all the wonders of this child. So it was willful. Well, it was from the ages of 2 to 7. Willful, a little more willful, a little less willful, and back to willful. I think it ended with willful at age 7. Unfortunately, I could never ask my mom, why, by the time I discovered this. But apparently, my independent spirit was alive and well at a very young age. I was baptized in the Presbyterian Church in Fredonia, at my grandmother's church. My grandmother went to the Presbyterian Church. My other set of grandparents went to Methodist Church, which we became Methodists in Hamburg. And I was very active in the Hamburg Methodist Church. And just to set the sights, it was a pretty sanctuary. And in the back, behind the choir loft, was a painting of a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, none other than Jesus, and holding a staff. And there was a sheep. Bob remembers this, I think, because we were married in this church. And the sheep was an oversized, very well-fed, woolly sheep that the blonde-haired Jesus, was caring for. That I never identified with that sheep, but that's okay. The church was an important part of my growing up, though. And I managed to memorize the books of the Bible. Can't do it now. Maybe it would be a good test for me to try to do it again. Recite a few Psalms and Bible verses. And my aging grandmother, the one whose church I had been baptized in, who lived with us for over 2.5 years, would stop by my bedroom. She had her own room upstairs, and she would stop by my bedroom in the evening after I'd gone upstairs and often quote a proverb that might help me in the airing of my ways, especially my anger, because my anger would come out from time to time. But alas, her reliance on Proverbs didn't change my life. Bob and I were married in that Methodist church, and what I thought was a simple and lovely ceremony, and then walked back down the street to our house. And there were no complaints from Bob about the ceremony, and he said, I do. So it's gone forward for 53 years now. And a few years later, our children were born, and they began their experience of a church in the Fairport Methodist Church, because theoretically, once a Methodist, always a Methodist. But we found our way back to a Presbyterian church years later. So I could go on with a biographical history, but this time I'm choosing not to. I'm going to shift the direction of my thoughts, and what I've thought of as windows to the holy. They're not necessarily in perfect sequential order, but they are pretty much. And the first story that I'm going to share is one from 1979, and this was shortly after our youngest, Greg, was born. It was May of 1979. And at that time, we had Ted, who was 2.5, and Laura, who was 4.5. And so my mother took pity on us, or worried about her grandchildren, one or the other, or on me, because Bob was away traveling. And she came and stayed with us for a few days. Bob was in Chicago or somewhere. So anyway, the day he came home, I went and picked him up at the airport, and my mother, always being gracious, had made something, a coffee cake or something that he liked, and these were still in his cream and sugar days, so there was milk or whatever, and a sterling, a pewter sugar bowl out on the table to have coffee when he came in. Well, Ted, who later on in life, when he was maybe 4, his pediatrician called him an accident waiting to happen, because all of our trips to emergency were Ted, or caused by Ted. But anyway, Ted, you're not here. I take it. Hopefully, I can tell family secrets. He managed to, I mean, you try to imagine this, but then imagine a 2.5-year-old. He saw this sugar bowl about 2/3 down the sugar wood, and he managed to lick some sugar out of the sugar bowl when nobody was looking. Now, I don't know if your grandchildren, if you have any, or your child, or if you have any, but anyway, Ted did this. Well, before long, we knew that the artery, or not, whatever's under, Bob can't even listen to the story, but under his tongue was bleeding profusely. I won't go into a long story, but the profuse bleeding got worse and worse, and Bob drove to Rochester General Hospital faster than anybody's driven on the, well, fortunately, my mother was there with the baby and with Laura. And the point is, we got to the hospital, and the bleeding had not stopped in the emergency. And the emergency room doctor came in and said that they wanted to give Teddy then a transfusion. And I heard this voice, I swear, inside of me. It was a voice that I just heard, and I said, no. And remember, this is 1979. And they looked at me like, how can you? I said, not yet. How long? And we talked, well, we could go, because the hematocrit was dropping. And I said, no. And I said, not unless his pediatrician says you must. And I said, you must get a hold of his pediatrician. And those were the days that pediatricians actually were near the phone, and you didn't get some hospitalist or somebody else. And they came in another time and said, we have to do it. And I said, and I just heard this voice. I just knew the answer was no. Well, the pediatrician called back, and he talked to me, talked to them, then talked to me. And I said, oh, he goes, I agree with you, unless it gets down to whatever level it was. So then the bleeding stopped. Somehow they were able to, stop the bleeding. And he was a stocky, strong, hardy little 2.5-year-old. And I think I gave him lots of molasses cookies and raisins and everything I could think of that had iron in it. And a week later, he was back in a very healthy range. His hematocrit was back. But I think to that now, and of course, at that time, I had no idea. Blood wasn't being tested. I had no idea about AIDS. I had no idea about any of this. I just heard this voice, and I knew this. And it's not the last time that's happened. I've had certain experiences over the last 40-some years where I've heard a voice and known something that there's no reason I would have known it except that I heard the voice and knew it. So that is the story of Teddy in the sugar bowl. And I felt held in a kind of clarity and well, it wasn't peace, so I put it that way, but kind of certainty that I knew what the answer was, and it was no. And the only person I would trust was my pediatrician, and to this day, I have great fondness. He's long since retired, but so that was an experience back in 1979. I'm going to jump now to an experience in the early 90s. And it's about being brave and how we learn to be brave and stepping up to the plate. And some of you are familiar with the book, How We Learn to Be Brave by Marianne Edgar Baudet, the priest at the National Cathedral. And just to set this story, she writes, stepping up to the plate is a choice. But there is a dimension to it that feels more like intuition or instinct. We act without relying on conscious thought or even emotion. Sometimes when the moment comes, we instantly know that we have the skills and resources needed for a given task. And we embrace it with confidence. At other times, we feel woefully inadequate and unprepared, yet saying no doesn't feel like an option. In those situations, we learn either to trust a power greater than ourselves, acting through our offerings, or the hard but necessary lessons of failure. On still other occasions, we hear a summons that blissfully lifts us out of lesser concerns and preoccupation to do something brave or good. And certainly we know that this is something that she has done more than once. So my experience was, as I say, in the early 90s, and I got one of those wonderful things calling me for jury duty. And nobody wants to get, well, maybe there are some people that love conflict and, want a week off of work or whatever it might get, or hope that they'll get called. Well, that was not the case with me, and I was working at the time at Harley, and I did have 3 kids, and I did have parents who needed me. And so maybe one time I called and said, this isn't a good time, but those opportunities run out sooner or later, you show up, which I did. And I got called for the panel and then questioned by both the prosecutor and the defense attorney a little bit about myself. And so when the defense attorney interviewed me or questioned me, he said, well, what organizations do you belong to? And I said, Downtown United Presbyterian Church is one of the things, and the Harley School, the Webster Resource Center, I was chosen. I wonder why. So this was a case of a young man who was being charged with drug selling, and I think it was cocaine, as I remember. But anyway, to make a long story short, it was clearly a setup, and it occurred in the city, in the corner of Goodman and South Clinton, apparently in a parking lot by a garage there. And it was so obvious that he was set up by the police. He was not of my color. And so here was this jury that we deliberated after all the information, and we could not come to a conclusion. We could not come to consensus. It was Friday, and the judge wanted to check this one off, to finish it off. So we were taken to a Hampton Inn somewhere, and with guards. I had to go to the ladies' room, and I was followed into the ladies' room. This was before cell phones, but nonetheless, who knows what I might be doing or talking to one of the jurors. And I can't remember dinner, but then we were bused back to the courtroom, and it got later and later. And finally, it was about 2 o'clock in the morning, and the judge said, "Are we going to come to consensus?" Madam, I was not the forelady, but she knew where I stood. And he said, is this jury ever going to be able to reach a verdict? And she looked over to me, and I went kind of like this, and she said, "No, sir. The forelady and I were the only ones who hung the jury. If there was any chance, if they felt there was any chance, we would have gone home or gone to a hotel. They would have put us in a hotel room for the night. We wouldn't have gone home and continued at 8 o'clock the next morning. But under the circumstances, we finally went home. It was a scary thing for me to do because, first of all, I was a lot younger. Second of all, there was pressure from others on the jury. The jury, I must say, was all Caucasian, and except for the forelady. And I knew it was so clear in my heart that this was a setup and that this man did not deserve years in jail. And he was maybe 18, something like that, to set his whole life off on a bad note. And I just thought, God, you are with me. Somehow I can do this. And I'll always remember that, and always think also that somehow Downtown Church had a reputation, and wonder, did that attorney hear that and decide? Who knows? Again, the impossible. Another time where I felt the Spirit very much with me was in the early 1990s. And I think this story tells about the Spirit appearing in many forms, and that I think I know. And so that I don't wander too much, I'm going to read a little bit about the story to give you the setting. We were on Jekyll Island with our kids, who were then teenagers, young teenagers. And Jekyll Island is a sacred place for us that we love to go to and have fond memories. And the first time we went with my parents, or joined my parents there with our 3 little ones. So this was years later. Our family had arrived only an hour earlier at an island haven off the southern coast of Georgia. While gazing at waves rolling and swelling and cresting, I was startled by a jarring sound of a persistent telephone. And this was a landline in the place we were staying. I was looking out the window. My father's deep, shaking voice on the other end, you could tell there was terror coursing through his veins. He said, "If your mother is going to live through the night, she must be moved from Kirkhaven to Genesee Hospital." Well, the journey had already been too long for my mother, who had dementia. And I responded, he said, "What do you think we should do?" And I said, "I support anything that you decide." But I said, if you're asking me, I would say, keep her where she's safe and comfortable. He said, "I can't do that." I said, "Then I support you. Remember, I support you." About 20 minutes later, probably 3 cigarettes later, he called me and said, "Your mother's going to stay at Kirkhaven." Torrents of relief and grief overcame me. And I thought, I can't stay here. And I need to go down to the beach. The sun had emerged from oppressive clouds and heavy rain, and a fresh breeze dried my tears. I thought if Mom were with me, what would she do on this afternoon? And it became clear we'd get ice cream cones and walk along the beach. So that's just what I did. I got a mint chocolate chip ice cream cone, which we both loved and I still love. And that energy from the sugar kept me going down to the beach. And I started walking and I thought, how could I feel so content while Mom lay there on her deathbed and I wasn't with her? And yet this sense of peace and contentment just came over me. Presence seemed near and an unexpected peace flowed through me. Looking ahead, my eyes fell on a graceful, pure white, snowy egret, standing just a few feet from me. How calmly she glanced around, basking in the generous light. Our eyes met, and I was startled by astonishing whiteness. Would she fly away? I approached cautiously. As I drew closer, we joined in this kind of gentle, rhythmic dance. She moved a little, I moved a little. She moved a little closer to the water, I moved a little closer to the water. I was all by myself with this egret. The beach was just about empty. The joy on the beach that afternoon was like none before. And I had a profound sense that Mom stood beside me, that she was right there. After a bit, the egret walked on ahead, even though I called out, "Stay with me. Stay with me." Returning to our island retreat, I waited for the phone call. It never came. Well, yet the telephone never rang. And the next morning, with disbelief on the part of the doctor and the head nurse at Kirkhaven, my mother was sitting up eating breakfast. 5 days later, it was 5 days later when Mom and I spent her final hours on Earth together. It's this feeling of a thin time when heaven and earth were all on the beach with me, and she was, I think, with me as that wonderful, beautiful white egret. And we brought a shell home for her, and that's with her right now. So I know that I was not alone then, and that I was comforted, and it was a wonderful example of joy and grief being together in a time that I will always remember. Another story is one which also speaks to the, that thin, permeable, luminous time where, again, you can't separate one realm from another. My brother-in-law, this was back in 1998, had passed. Bob's sister's husband had passed, and I was asked to do the graveside service. His other service was at Unitarian Church, and Bill and Joan, maybe somebody else too, but I remember Bill and Joan, Becky might have been there, were there at the service. And before I tell the story, I'd like to read a poem from Jane Kenyon's book, Otherwise. And I think many of you are familiar with this poem, and it's often shared at times of people's departure. Let evening come. Let the light of late afternoon shine through chinks in the barn, moving up the bales as the sun moves down. Let the cricket take up chafing as a woman takes up her needles and her yarn. Let evening come. Let dew collect on the hoe abandoned in long grass. Let the stars appear and the moon disclose her silver horn. Let the fox go back to its sandy den. Let the wind die down. Let the shed go black inside. Let evening come. To the bottle in the ditch, to the scoop in the oats, to air in the lung, let evening come. Let it come as it will. And don't be afraid. God does not leave us comfortless. So let evening come. So we were in Whitehaven Cemetery near the back, or what was the back in 1998, and it was not a January like this January. It was a January which was muddy and murky and maybe just below freezing and then just above freezing, and the ground was all mud with a little bit of slush there, but nothing like what we've been through here. So we were able to be in the cemetery. And so I read this poem as part of the service. As I read this poem, now Jim was, first of all, Jim was a hunter. There's nothing he loved more than going out and looking for deer and hunting deer. He was a hiker. He was a real outdoorsman. So that's one reason why I chose this poem to talk about Jim. And so we, at their service, were in kind of a U, and they had carpeting down. So everybody was facing the cemetery. The backwoods of the cemetery. And it was very misty and murky, and you could kind of see the trees, but it was almost ethereal. I read the poem, and as I started the poem, deer, Bob can attest to this, deer, one by one, the deer circled and came out of the woods and circled just in front of the trees. I say circled, kind of made their own semicircle there. And I looked as I was at the end of this U, and I looked at our kids, I looked at Ted, and his eyes were like, kind of. Then a fox stepped forth as I was reading, Let Evening Come, and the fox going back to its den. And as I was reading that, there was a fox that stood in that reverent circle as if they were all there, part of this poem. And then I saw Ted's eyes really like, and after I read that, before I finished reading, before I finished the service, the funeral director who was standing next to me leaned over. He goes, I've been in this business for a lot of years. He said, I've never seen this. I've never seen anything like it. And I said, some things are beyond explaining. But I have always felt, again, that Jim and God or Holy Spirit or Beloved One were very much present in that service, and that Jim was still with us as we looked at the deer. Not with us in an urn, with us in the spirit and the beauty of that time. I've had many times that I have felt that as I wrote in the little blurb, that there is no line between this realm and the next, and that somehow we can touch another realm even while our feet are planted in this one. And we had an experience, Bob and I did, maybe Greg was with us, I'm not sure. We went up to Northfield, the cemetery in Northfield, Massachusetts. Bob, being the historian that he is, we were looking to see if we could find the gravestone for my great, on down the list, grandfather. Problem is, the family name is Smith, not Rashane. So it was a wild goose chase, kind of, but we knew that the Shepherds and the Smiths married, and there was a Shepherd headstone there, I guess. The Strattons, I'm so good with the history. The Strattons and the Smiths married at one point, and the so-and-sos and the so-and-sos. married the Smiths. So, and in that cemetery, there was a Stratton headstone. And so anyway, it was a nice spring day. And this was if nothing else, a nice place to go and then go have lunch with Greg. So we got to the cemetery, and I'm not sure if we reached any success in terms of, finding your roots, but it was a beautiful old cemetery, and we lingered there for a while and walked among some of these old gravestones, headstones. Deciding that we were done, we got in the car, and the main road or path, whatever, in the cemetery for cars, went around the back kind of as a U, and we kind of came around the curve of that, and I looked, and there was a chair, just the most amazing chair. And I said, let's stop a minute. It wasn't, like a folding chair here. It was a chair. It was wire. It was a wire. Much of it was wire. And it had been cemented or it was encased in cement. Whoever put it there clearly wanted to make sure that nobody walked away with his chair. I'm saying his because I have sense it was his. And we got out, we looked at the chair, and we looked at some of the gravestones, and some of them were children who were very, very young. And again, I felt like I was somehow there with this person, and yet here in 2000 something, and that I was somehow carried and with the person that had sat in this chair. And so I wrote a poem when I got home, and this is the poem that I wrote about feeling like I was not just standing in the cemetery. Well, I was in the cemetery, but that I was in a different time in the cemetery. And the poem is called Twilight's Whisper. I almost knew him, this man beneath the beech in the back corner of the cemetery, 2 centuries ago. I see she passed on years before, perhaps in childbirth like so many, and this broad presence, once a sapling planted to keep company with grief, now shading the entire family. A row of granite slabs etched with angels, names, and dates. The chair, rusted, twisted, bent with age, firmly tethered in cement. Assurance it will not wander off and leave him comfortless. How is it I see the warped wire seat, cushioned by her needle and thread, and also the faded quilt, her days pieced together, spread across his lap. He sits facing east, clouded eyes fixed upon old forest yet unmarred. Sunlight warms his shoulders as it slips through oval leaves. His old mare stands half asleep, knowing well this daily ritual of gentle conversation. While the sun settles for the night, a serenade of birdsong until twilight's whisper brings a nod, a step, then 2 and 3. The chair alone, once more, keeping watch. That was my experience. Perhaps feeling the night come was the cloud that covered the sun for a brief time. I can explain this in so many ways, but I choose not to. I choose to have been with that man who must have come to that cemetery over and over again, sitting next to his wife's marker. God shows up in so many places. In the interest of time, I won't read Monday afternoon, maybe another time, But I wrote a piece, actually, it was in my journal. I used to go down to Washington, D.C. when Laura was teaching. I don't know if Laura's still here, and Elena, but Laura was teaching in a school in Anacostia, working for Teach for America for 3 years. And I would go down during the February break and then again at the end of the year. And because I was working at Harley then, the end of the year was earlier than public schools. And we would team teach. And I wrote a piece called Monday Afternoon, and about the playground, sitting out in the playground that afternoon. And it reminds me, and I'm mindful of Romans 15:13. We come to the God of hope, who meets us where we are. And all of a sudden, on this tattered blacktop with broken glass and high rises all around, a school with no glass windows, I felt like I was on holy ground. These were happy children. It was in February, one of those days that in Washington, D.C. gives you a hint of spring. And the kids had thrown their winter jackets off. Up here, it was probably still snowing. But being there at that time, in that moment, again, it felt like I was in the holiest of holies. It was like a temple in the joy and the laughter and the happiness at that time, brief happiness of children, young children, enjoying perhaps the first spring day and each other and their teacher at that time, Miss Rashane. I would be remiss if I didn't include my time as parish deacon. The 7 years or close to 7 years that I filled that role here. And I can't begin to tell you of holy moments in that journey. I guess one thing that came to mind immediately was all the butterfly stories. And many of you remember Ray and Ellie Newell and their history with butterflies and chrysalises. And Ray would find eggs, and I'd go out to the canal. I couldn't find an egg anywhere, but Ray would find butterfly eggs. He even showed us one year how to take the eggs and put them in like a terrarium and have the caterpillars hatch. And oh my gosh, we put it on our back porch, which is enclosed. What I didn't realize is the fragrance of a whole bunch of caterpillars eating away in a closed room. We didn't do that the next year. But Ray had, just such a joy. They both did. And Ellie often said she had so many stories that we should sit down and write a book of butterfly stories. Well, unfortunately, Ellie and I never get around to that. But there are wonderful butterfly stories. And one of them, which I still remember with such joy, is Frances Gebeline, who Sam remembers, and a few of us remember, and some of us do not. I called on her when she was in a nursing home. Can't remember which one it was, doesn't matter. But her aide was a delightful woman. And Frances knew about her aide's daughter and granddaughter, and learned that her granddaughter was going to turn 5. And so, meanwhile, I or Ray and Ellie, I'm not sure which one of us, brought the chrysalis to Frances because we thought it would be wonderful for her to see the chrysalis open in the nursing home. Well, Frances decided that she was going to send the chrysalis home with her aide because this little girl was going to be turning 5 in a couple of days or whatever, and that this should be Frances's birthday present to the little girl. So when I came in the next day or whenever, the chrysalis wasn't there. And I asked her, I said, what happened? And she told me the story. Well, my next visit, she told me, a week or so later, she told me, guess what? And what? She said, the butterfly came out during this little girl's birthday party. And that is the kind of joy and miracle. And I could share so many stories of butterflies that I was so privileged to be a part of. And it speaks, I think, again, to the sense of we don't know everything. We don't time everything. The holy is with us. And these things don't in my mind, don't just happen. There was a time also after Celi's departure from working in pastoral care here at the church that I returned to that role for 9 months. In January of that year, which probably was something like 7 years ago, 6 years ago, something, I had been asked to watch Grace Nwagbarocha. I think she was approaching 2 at the time. Jonathan and Laura were going out to dinner or something in the evening, and so I put Grace to bed with her usual bedtime procedure and, the story, the whatever, the blanket, and then stayed upstairs with her as she lay down in her crib and just kind of hummed some songs for her, and she drifted off to sleep pretty quickly. I drove down Elmwood Avenue on my way home, and I thought, oh, there's the Friendly Home. Dane Gordon is here. I know that he's waiting. I had heard that he was waiting for his beloved grandson to arrive, and he was in the process of dying. And I knew that, and I thought, I wonder if his grandson has arrived. So I went into the Friendly Home, and they told me at the desk that he was on his way. He was on a train. He was coming from New York, and then he was going to get a cab from the train station to the Friendly Home. But he hadn't arrived yet. They said the train had arrived, but he wasn't there yet. So I sat with Dane and assured him that Dane wasn't conscious, but I knew he could hear me. I assured him that his son, and I can't remember his name now, his grandson, was in Rochester and would be here shortly. And I stayed maybe 10, 15 minutes, something like that. And in walked this handsome young man, probably in his early 20s, who had come from New York to be here with his beloved grandfather. And I introduced myself and I said, "You've made it. I'm going to leave. This is your time with your grandfather." And he thanked me very warmly. And I left and signed out of the nursing home so I could see what time I had left. I learned the next morning that I probably had not even started my car, and Dane left. He had waited for his grandson. And as I say, and I know that because they could see what time I signed out, and they knew what time he passed. So again, as part of my parish deacon, and there's so many stories, I could spend the whole time talking about some of these stories. It was an experience of profound mystery and yet profound knowing that God was so present in this, and that I had been given the privilege and the gift of putting Grace to bed and being there with Dane, who must have been in his 90s at that point. And the breadth of life, the young life, the older life, and how precious each one of these lives are. And we certainly know that right now and are aware of that. I have so many more things I could share, but I did want to just touch on Bob's and my retreat, we call it, at our land. And that for us has become such a sacred place. And I didn't have a chance to talk about also my experience with Jimmy Carter. That began with a brochure, looking into the eyes of a child, probably 9 or 10 years old, from Liberia. And my experience is looking into certain children's eyes is that God speaks to me sometimes through the eyes of a child. And that certainly happened then. And while I don't have time to share the whole story, the brochure was in our mailbox, and I sat with it for the longest time. That brochure led to my being with Jimmy Carter in person in 2013. It's a long, beautiful story, and I had the opportunity to be there at the Carter Center and to shake hands with him and to listen to him speak to the people gathered there. So I put this here. I also have a book of the Carter Center. And this picture I took last year. We were in Gloucester when I found out that Jimmy Carter had passed. And this is the Veterans Cemetery down the road from Laura and Dave and Elena. And I took this picture. Again, notice this was late December 2025. See all the snow that's not there? Shows us how these winters are so different. And one more thing I wanted to mention was, or another thing I'd like to mention in closing also, is that early this summer, I thought, how am I ever going to enjoy summer? Because I love summer. But I was so troubled. And my heart was so broken already by all that had happened. And I was so worried about our family and continue to be. And so just despairing of all that we are going through as a country and, of course, through the world. And I had an experience of picking strawberries with Elena. And Elena picked a strawberry out at Chase Farms, where some of us have picked strawberries before. And Elena picked a strawberry, and there was a little snail, a little tiny snail, looked like a little slug on the strawberry. And she was so excited and wanted to bring it home because she loves every living thing. And then I saw one on another straw, and she said, I'm going to call him Goldenfield. And okay, Goldenfield, the slug. And so I had one. I said, well, I think I'll name mine Summerfield, but I'm going to leave Summerfield in the strawberry patch because I'm kind of busy and I don't really have time to care, take the kind of care I need to with Summerfield. But Goldenfield came home with us. And she took very good care of Goldenfield, but then 2 or 3 days later, she had to leave. And I said, well, you going to bring Goldenfield back to Gloucester? And she said, no, that wouldn't be good. He'd be too far from home. I'm going to, and the ride might not be good for him. And the strawberry was still in the jar with Goldenfield, but it might run out. So she put a note to the fairies on the back step with the glass jar and Goldenfield in the jar. And I don't know where it could have gone. But Goldenfield went. The next morning, Goldenfield was gone. So I wrote a haiku about this, and I wrote, Happy Goldenfield, sun-drenched on a ripe berry, welcomed by fairies. And that was kind of the beginning for me of a delight-filled summer where I wrote haiku a number of times, many things that happened. And it helped me to focus in the moment, to give thanks for life and all its fullness. And to really, shortly after that, I found a wonderful book called Haiku, The Sacred Art, a sacred practice in 3 lines. And I felt like I'd found a soulmate in the author of this book. And so to close, I just appreciate you all being here and listening to some of my stories, some of which I've not shared, and knowing that for me, the Spirit has been here all along, and these remind me that I am not alone, and that we have to acknowledge the preciousness of life. But while we do it, there is hope, and there is a presence with us as we go forward on the journey. So thank you.
Sure, there are many of us who want to say thank you. I feel like you've held my hand and taken me to your thin places this morning. I don't know if anybody else felt that, but I just felt like you accompanied me on a very special journey. I had tears often, as I think others did. Thank you so much for coming and being
Thank you
here.
for being part of my journey.
And next week, please come back because Grania Marcus is going to share her journey with us. So that will also be very special. So good to see you, Laura and Elena. Did I say that correctly? And everyone else who's online. It's wonderful to have, I think, a new record of people who've joined us online. So thank you.
Love you all.